Americans have a pretty short memory. So when we see something dramatic happen like yesterday's record drop in the Dow, we tend to blame, oh, yeah, I think it's his fault. But the real story is that the seeds of almost every crisis we face, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the gas shortages in the Southeast that are happening right now, to this financial crisis, these seeds were planted a long, long time ago. Let me read you a few highlights from a New York Times article to prove my point. Quote, in a move that could help increase home ownership rates among minorities and low-income consumers, the Fannie Mae Corporation is easing the credit requirements on loans that it will purchase from banks and other lenders. The action will encourage those banks to extend home mortgages to individuals whose credit is generally not good enough to qualify for conventional loans. Fannie Mae, the nation's biggest underwriter of home mortgages, has been under increasing pressure from the administration to expand mortgage loans among low and moderate income people. In addition, banks, thrift institutions, and mortgage companies have been pressing Fannie Mae to help them make more loans to these so-called subprime borrowers. In moving, even tentatively, into this new area of lending, Fannie Mae is taking on significantly more risk, which may not pose any difficulties during the flush economic times, but the government-subsidized corporation may run into trouble in an economic downturn, prompting a government rescue similar to that of the savings and loan industry in the 1980s. So you know, that article was published exactly 9 years ago today, September 30th, 1999. The administration that was pressuring Fannie Mae, the Clinton administration. The point is, this storm has been building for an awfully long time, and both sides are dirty in it. But it began with a seemingly harmless concept, the idea that home ownership is the American dream, and therefore a right and not a privilege. Gee, have I heard that on the campaign trail lately. This idea was championed by groups like the Association of Community Organizers for Reform Now, or ACORN for short. This is a group that lobbies, or if I may speak plainly, blackmails companies and politicians into meeting their demands. ACORN screams affirmative action to scare lenders and then volunteers to serve as advisors to those same lenders that will change their practices. In other words, they threaten to expose people as racist unless they agree to ACORN's idea of reform. It is a scam, pure and simple. The ironic part of all of this is that people actually call ACORN a group of community organizers, which also happens to be the title of, Barack Obama, that he's so fond of. Unfortunately, the title isn't the only thing that they have in common, as David Freddoso, author of The Case Against Barack Obama and political reporter for National Review, will explain here. First, am I being too strong in saying that they engage in blackmail? David.
Well, now, blackmail is a crime, of course, but it's something that very much resembles that. The idea here is that if your bank isn't willing to do what we want to make these risky loans, we are going to use every legal avenue we have. The Community Reinvestment Act of 1977 allowed groups like ACORN to object when banks wanted to engage in certain transactions that required federal approval. For example, if they wanted to do a merger. Beginning in 1990 in Illinois, actually, ACORN, headed by an activist leader who's close with Barack Obama, Madeleine Talbot. This is, by the way, an excellent piece in the New York Post recently by Stanley Kurtz outlining all of this. Beginning in 1990 in Illinois, ACORN began a campaign of intimidating these banks into making more of these loans, or else they would file and start proceedings to try to block bank mergers and block the banks from doing what they wanted to do.
And so, they would. Just we have such a short period of time. So what they would do is the banks would relieve their pressure. They would just give in, do it, because they didn't want to be called racist and they wanted to be able to open up. But then they would move that extra money over to Fannie and Freddie, right, to relieve the pressure off of them.
This is where Fannie Mae where Fannie Mae comes in and is so important, because they were able to buy the risk from the banks. They keep the banks liquid to make more bad loans by buying loans that are worse and worse. And that story you read from the New York Times, that was key in them expanding the pool of loans they were willing to buy.
It was a praise piece, believe it or not, in 1999. Now,
yes,
Obama has connections. There was not only in this bailout bill, 20% of all the profit was supposed to go to a slush fund for ACORN, which is campaigning now, if I'm not mistaken, for Barack Obama. But what is his connection to ACORN?
Well, Obama's connection to Acorn is very extensive. There was a recent, I believe a couple years ago, an article in which one of Acorn's leaders said, hey, you know, he's like an old friend of ours. It's only natural that people from Acorn would volunteer to work on his state Senate campaigns and his U.S. Senate campaign. And it's very likely that his presidential campaign will also be featuring Acorn volunteers out working for him. They also register voters. Obama headed up Acorn's voter registration drive in Chicago, but unfortunately those drives are known nowadays mostly for the voter fraud allegations and convictions that have come down.
Well, one of the groups at the center of this financial crisis is a so-called community activist group known as Acorn. In point of fact, Acorn is a left-wing special interest group now under investigation for embezzlement, voter fraud, and providing mortgages to illegal aliens, among other things. The group, Acorn, lobbied Congress for years to allow more of those risky mortgages that in part led to this crisis. And now Acorn stands to reap hundreds of millions of dollars from a government bailout of Wall Street. Lisa Sylvester has our report.
Acorn, the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, rallied in front of the Miami Federal Reserve Bank. The group is pointing fingers at Wall Street for causing the financial meltdown. But critics say this community activist group shares the blame.
They've always lobbied Congress to do everything they could to make more and more, or force banks to make more and more loans to low and moderate income people, which is a very noble sounding goal. But unfortunately, they have contributed to the financial ruination of thousands of low-income families.
It goes back to something known as the Community Reinvestment Act that passed in 1977. The law ordered banks to make loans to low and moderate income people. The Consumer Rights League says Acorn stepped in and used that law to pressure banks to lend to subprime borrowers, even those who couldn't demonstrate the capability to pay back the loan.
Back in the early 90s, they would stage protest at banks that, they sued them for redlining. They were engaged in legal action.
Enter deregulation in the 90s. Then Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac began purchasing these mortgages and selling them to private investors. And the subprime market took off. Former Clinton administration official Franklin Raines, who ran Fannie Mae, amassed $90 million in 6 years he ran Fannie. Home ownership was up, which pleased groups like Acorn, and Wall Street made a ton of money until home prices started falling. But Acorn says it's not to blame. It's all about greed.
When you look at all the bad subprime loans that were made in the last 5 years, 3 out of 4 of them were made by institutions that are not governed by the CRA. So there's no way you can blame the CRA on 75% of the subprime loans that were made in the last 5 years.
And Acorn, which calls itself the nation's largest grassroots organization of low and moderate income families, has come under fire for other issues. At least 5 states have opened investigations into its voter registration drives, and Acorn employees have been convicted of voter fraud. Still, this group, as you mentioned, stood to benefit from the bailout deal, and part of any profit realized from the sale of troubled assets were to go into a fund, and that money would be distributed to low-income housing advocacy groups, including Acorn, Lou.
Yeah, and think about this. In the midst of this, everyone talking about a clean bill and the Democratic leadership, let's be clear. This is a straightforward deal for Acorn and other groups, left-wing groups, set up by the Democratic leadership of Congress. They're not interested in the bailout per se. They want to spread this out. And as many people believe that this bailout in part is dear to the Democratic leadership because they want to advance a social agenda here as much as an economic bailout of Wall Street.
Yeah, Lou, in fact, what they did is in a prior legislation, they actually created these 2 funds. And now essentially what they were going to do is try to use this bailout to fund and put money in those funds in order to benefit groups like Acorn and in order to advance some of their causes, as you mentioned, including their voter registration drives, Lou.
This is pitiful. And the fact that, of course, this Congress is fully supportive of this nonsense is all the more disgusting. So voters right now, all of us as citizens, have a lot to be disgusted with on Capitol Hill. Thank you very much, Lisa. Lisa Sylvester reporting. Up next, what may be the clearest sign yet that this bailout for Wall Street puts the interests of business ahead of the people. The Chamber of Commerce and the Business Roundtable, where are they? Are they working behind the scenes? Because they're sure not out in public. They support it wholeheartedly. We'll be telling you about that. And later I'll be joined by 3 of the brightest economic minds in the country. We'll be talking about the market sell-off today and that that little bailout thing. Stay with us. We'll be right back.